Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à European Lab. Il s'agit du forum des 10 ans. Ce projet est né en 2011 déjà et consiste à réunir des artistes, activistes, intellectuels pour penser la culture de demain, l'impact des technologies sur nos métiers, pour parler aussi d'enjeux de citoyenneté en Europe. Là, nous sommes sur le canal vidéo, le plateau télé, pour parler du nouveau programme Europe Créative, dont on connaît les dates, le contenu à peu près. Pascal Brunet nous en dira plus. On a eu les dates ce matin même. Et cette intervention se passe aussi en partenariat avec Sfera, qui est une coopération européenne dans le cadre c'est un projet pilote de la DG Connect qui réunit 10 médias émergents et producteurs de contenu à destination de la jeunesse. Il s'agit de contribuer à créer une plateforme de contenu pour s'adresser à la jeunesse européenne. Et il nous paraissait intéressant de décrypter ensemble ces nouveaux programmes dont on sait que les moyens financiers vont être assez importants puisqu'ils augmentent de 50%. Donc ils ouvrent pas mal de perspectives pour les porteurs de projets culturels et aussi médias, dont nous parlerons dans un deuxième temps sur le plateau radio. Mais je laisse tout de suite la parole à Antoine Pecqueur, journaliste.
Antoine Pecqueur, straight away, a journalist in different media,
France
Music, and others, who is also the author of an atlas of culture, who has a geopolitical view of culture, which is very interesting, who's going to moderate the debate. Thank you, Anne-Caroline. The debate is going to last approximately 1 hour, and after that there'll be 1/4 of an hour for questions and answers, so please feel free to ask any questions you might have, and we'll try to get some answers together. The theme of the discussion today, this afternoon, is Creative Europe, what New Deal for Europe? So fitting in with the New Deal in the US with Joe Biden. So we're going to see whether in Europe and in culture we can also talk about a New Deal. I have the pleasure of having Elise Famja here with me from Europe, a European network for music. We'll be talking about that in a moment, and to have your opinion more particularly on music and what Creative Europe can do for that. On my left, Pascal Brunet, thank you for being with us, the director of Relais Culture Europe, the officers for Creative Europe in France, so you're familiar with European programs in culture, and remotely, as is normal at the moment with our digital systems, we have Gabriele Rosana, Director of Culture Action Europe, who do lobbying for an organization representing cultural organizations all over Europe, and Gabriele will be speaking to us from Brussels to give his viewpoint. So hello, Gabriele, I hope that you can hear us.
Merci à vous.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us here today. So we're going to begin the debate with the figures. So Caroline gave them at the beginning. I think it is important to mention this. As you know, European programs, the European budget framework, is over a 7-year period. So the period here is from 2021 through to 2027. The previous one was 2014 to 2020. Now, after this huge health crisis, which has hit many sectors, and notably culture, and the budget of Creative Europe has therefore been increased. There is also other funding for Europe, for culture in Europe through the structural funds, but Creative Europe is a very important part of this, an increase in the budget by 67%, from 1.4 billion for the last period through to the new period at 2.4 billion euros. We'll go into the details of the figures and how those figures break down in a moment. And we'll
Pascal Brunet.
that together. But first of all, Pascal Brunet, perhaps you could give your opinion
à ce budget d'Europe créative en
regarding
hausse.
this
On a vu
bigger
notamment pour
budget
les
for Creative
parlementaires
Europe.
européens,
We
c'était
saw that
important
for the
de marquer
European
le coup pour
Parlement,
soutenir
it
un
was
secteur
important to show
lourdement impacté par
support
la
for a
crise
sector
sanitaire.
which has been
Est-ce que
hit
c'est
hard
d'autant plus important
by the
que
health
dans le plan de
crisis?
relance
And
de
is this
l'Union
all the more
européenne,
important insofar as in the recovery program of 750 billion for Europe, there's no obligation for the countries themselves to invest in Europe, and therefore Creative Europe did need to be supported? Yes, absolutely. It's true that culture is not really a mandatory power of the European Union. This is something which is here the European Union is supporting culture without really having anything in the European texts to provide the legal basis for this.
Compétence récente, instaurée dans
so that within the Treaty of Maastricht, this first appeared with very limited powers, and in Maastricht it really is reduced to just a small amount of support. So this is something which is taking shape in European construction. This what appears to be a long construction process, but having said that, 70 years is not as long as all that. So in these cultural questions for Creative Europe, we have to see that this is the only program to be allocated to a specific sector. Almost all the European programs work on cross-cutting themes, local development, not for a specific sector of activity. So there are signs like this which are interesting to see this particular attention for culture and to see the emergence of a beginning of a cultural approach in Europe after the health crisis. So I think what's interesting at the moment is this affirmation of this competency which is taking shape. We're a long way from having a cultural policy, but something which is taking shape there. So you're saying ultimately that the health crisis has had perhaps a positive impact in making Europe aware of the fact that culture can perhaps be developed further. A positive impact obviously is a bit difficult to say after what we've been through, but we do see that there are a lot of things which are being done now when could not have been imagined before the crisis. So perhaps the crisis has place emphasis on this question of Europe, whether Europe is effective, etc., etc., in public debate. And at the same time, we're seeing powers here being asserted which go beyond the traditional conventional powers of Europe, which were considered perhaps as being more questions of economic organization or others. So here we have something which is taking shape, which is emerging, and the past year has emphasized this.
Collectivement pour redistribuer, on parlait pour une relance, peut-être.
Money with the recovery plan, and perhaps things like this do constitute an important message for European construction. So we have this cultural tool here, which makes culture one of the key components of European construction. Obviously, let's not get ahead of ourselves. 2.4 billion is a tiny part of the European budget. It's 0.14% of the European budget, and you're right to point that out. But having said that, this has to be taken in relative terms, because if we take the overall budget of Europe for the 2021 to 27, if we add in the recovery plan, we end up as pretty much the same percentage for Creative Europe as for the previous period. But we do have other programs in culture. The research program is opening up to culture with a certain
de
number of
recherches qui sont
objectives,
posées au regard des grands. On a beaucoup de mutations techniques, sociales.
Social, environmental changes which are underway. We have to understand how to address these. So for the Horizon Europe research program, that is opening up very clearly to culture, and in Erasmus as well, there is a focus on cultural training. So in all the different programs you have this. So if to analyze this, so some have said in total, if we add all the structural funds and everything, we come to about 10 billion. It's quite complicated, obviously, to calculate if you include the structural funds, for example, castles which receive visitors. It's always difficult to define the scope. But I think at the same time, there is this affirmation of a stronger conceptual approach to what we want to do in Europe, in culture,
au niveau locaux, au niveau national.
Ça, je pense que perhaps by Europe and the things to be done more at the local level. And we'll go into detail of the breakdown of the budget in a moment. So, Elise, I'll turn to you now. In your view of things as a European network for music, how do you see the management by Europe of the health crisis and its impact on the cultural sector? So, what has worked and what has worked less well?
Merci Antoine.
Thank you, Antoine. I would say first of all that the health crisis
sur nos projets financés
on our projects financed by Creative Europe. As Pascal pointed out, these are projects which are funded with a clear mandate with subsidiarity and cross-border projects which have been impacted particularly hard by the crisis and by the restrictions on mobility in Europe.
Dans un premier
So
temps,
I would say, first of all, in very practical terms for us, the projects funded by Creative Europe faced, obviously, were treated very carefully by the executive agency which manages the funds, which had a very flexible attitude on what we could do in modifying the work programs, which usually on a project are binding in terms of the scheduling of the operations. So in very practical terms, they did listen to us. They were very flexible, much more flexibility on this. And with European projects, that's quite something, knowing how it usually works. So, and perhaps we should get away from the cliches about the way that Europe manages its funds. They really adapted a lot. There was a lot of adaptation. I think that was necessary. Regarding the more general management of the financial crisis and the crisis for culture, we wouldn't have had such a large increase in the program for Creative Europe without this financial crisis, I think. We were supposed to be getting an increase which wasn't as large as that for culture, and this is also thanks to the mobilization of a lot of stakeholders, our organizations, Gabriele's as well, and a lot of mobilization of the sector to call for a bigger investment in the cultural sector. And also this was heard by the European Parliament in particular. So ultimately it is a crisis which did turn the spotlight on our sector, and for the recovery plan there was also this resolution from the European Parliament calling for 2% of the stimulus or recovery plan to be dedicated to culture, but that's not a binding decision. We have countries like France which have gone for that 2% figure, but it is something that we do have to be very vigilant towards. So to give some figures as to the impact of on the cultural sector, there was a study done by EY-G5 on this subject, so a drop of 31% in the revenues of the cultural and creative economy in Europe. So a drastic drop. So so a big drop there of 37% with different impacts, but in the performing arts and music, those are among those which were hit hardest. Yeah, I think this is good to mention that study. It's one of the only studies we have, the only figures we have on the impact of the crisis. 90% loss for the performing arts, 76% lost for music in revenue. So we're seeing today that and also they're going to be the last sectors which are going to be able to pull out of the crisis. And I'm thinking of all the work that we have done in recent years, even before the crisis, in music, to calling for more funds to be dedicated to our sector with Music Moves Europe initiative, which some of the people here in the audience may be familiar with. And for me, this initiative has enabled us to try out a lot of things, data collection systems in music to find out what funding, what financing is available for the sector. And we are seeing that with all these models which we have started testing had been in place during the crisis, the sector would have been much more resilient. So we're now going to head off to Brussels, to Gabriele. Rosana, I hope you can hear us still from Brussels. So obviously, if we're talking about Europe, we have to go to Brussels. So a quick word now about the recovery plan, 750 billion euros, but no obligation for the states to invest in culture. So for you, as an actor, as a lobbyist in Europe, is this not something of a failure that we couldn't get this to be made binding? Thank you for the question, and thank you for organizing this discussion. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person in Lyon. But as you said earlier, we're using these technical resources which we've started getting used to now during the crisis. So if it's not a problem for you, I think I'm going to switch languages and make the most of the interpreting that we have on Zoom. I'm logged in for the interpreting, so I'm going to switch language, and and that way we can apply the multilingual approach of Europe. I'll switch over to English.
If that's okay for the interpreters, and switch now to English. And that's precisely, the topic you were referring, that of the recovery plan for Europe, 750 billion euros in 2018 prices. It's more than 800 billion euros in current prices that the EU will spend for the recovery in the 5 years to come, so until 2026. Unfortunately not. It was not, there was not a specific figure earmarked for culture. What we know in terms of specific earmarkings in the Next Generation EU, in the recovery plan, are basically two figures, those of the twin transition, 37% for the Green Deal and 20% for the digital transition. Those are the two percentages that are clearly mentioned. Many other cross-cutting policy priorities like gender equality, which is at the heart of some national plans, is, for example, not then broken down in numbers. What we have done together with more than 100 cultural and pan-European organizations, including Live Europe that Elise mentioned before, is indeed a campaign, that of the 2% for culture. We were all hoping for it could become mandatory. It could be enshrined in the legal basis of the regulation so that member states then had to include culture in their plans. It didn't happen, especially because of that feeble competence the Union has in cultural policy that Pascal was quoting before. It didn't happen, but what is happening is culture is gaining and gaining and gaining more centrality in the EU political debate. We see that not only from Brussels, but also from the capitals that are now designing and implementing those recovery plans. So what we see now is that, 23 member states out of 27 have presented their plans. The Commission is especially evaluating those. And what we see is indeed that there can be good practices to be exchanged. It was quoted France before by Elise. France inspired all of us at the beginning of this exercise because, it was the first country to present France Relance, so a national plan for the recovery, which had 2 billion out of 100 for 2 years spending for culture, from live performing to cultural heritage. It was then France that a bit led us by its example in the 2% campaign, where, as I said, 110 organizations joined us. And it's France that now we're looking at also. Let's see how the funds are implemented and how this can act as a good practices for the other member states. I can give you just a few more figures of other plans that we have got the chance to analyze. We go from less than 1%, unfortunately, from Spain, specifically dedicated to culture. But then it's true that culture can also get recovery funds from other envelopes and chapters in the recovery plans, to almost 4% in Italy, 3.6% to culture and tourism in Italy. So just to give you also the sense that a political debate is happening, and it's not that the fight is over at all. I mean, this is about the next 5 years, but I think that precisely regaining central ground for culture in the EU political debate is what has happened due to the pandemic and what we need to continue working on.
Gabriele, est-ce que vous appelez...
Gabriele, in relation to this situation, are you calling for culture to be a more important power of the EU? You said, and Pascal said, culture is a power, a recent power where the EU can provide support only, but ultimately would the big change, which some people are calling for, and I'm thinking here of the book from Jean-Noël Tron, the president of the SACEM in France, who's calling for a new European policy for culture. For you also, is this something that you would like to see and which you are in favor of? We launched a cultural pact for Europe. So yes, this is something we would like to see. Also something that, and with the conference on the future of Europe as well, we need to think all together as European citizens about the future of Europe. And do we need to have a specific cultural powers for the EU? I think that is the case, yes. But at the same time, a few months ago, one of the vice presidents of the European Commission spoke in the European Parliament to say that the citizens aren't familiar, in fact, with what the powers of the EU are, or the powers the EU does not have. So what we need to see is what the citizens are interested in, and after that we can perhaps change the rules which can be changed according to the expectations of citizens. And one last question for Gabriele. For you, is Brexit and the departure of the UK, is that bad news? The UK was a big contributor to Creative Europe, or is that good news because ultimately the very free market Anglo-Saxon model didn't really fit well with the more subsidized model in the mainland European countries? So how do you see the impact of the departure of the UK from the European Union?
English, sorry. The question about the UK. I mean, we always, I think that that's precisely on us as culture and creative sectors to leave the light on for the UK to at some point be back. And what I see from the also membership of Culture Action Europe that is on the other shore of the channel is that they are craving for continuing being part of the cultural debate in Europe. So that door should be always open, especially now that mobility is starting again. We should make sure that indeed also the mobility across the channel is kept and upheld. On the other hand, yes, and in one way, I think that also what the pandemic is teaching us is that culture is not only an economic value for Europe. It's not just a sector of the economy. It's an important sector of the economy. It has an absolute European added value in terms also of industries, but it's way more than that. It's about also the well-being of the Europeans. It's also about who we are as societies in plural. So I think that in that sense, the pandemic and I mean also a more European reflection in that sense can teach us that can show us the way forward and the fact that indeed it's way more than just a sector of the economy, and that has other rules that, I mean, it's governed by other rules that are not purely and simple those of the free market, and we should, as simple as that, take that into account, and also empower other ways of financing, which is not only, of course, the subsidies, but also systems of public and private partnerships, and so on and so forth.
Des modèles effectivement très différents.
So very different models and a change of paradigm for the European Union in a very short time. So now if we could start looking at the budget for Creative Europe, we talked about 2021 to 2027, 2.4 billion. How is that divided out? So what we see is that there is a big winner, which is the media sector, 1.4 billion euros. So I'll turn to you, Pascal. The media sector, that's the cinema, the movies, they are the big winners in this. Audiovisual and the cinema, perhaps. So to come back to the earlier conversations, I think with Creative Europe, we see it's not really a structural program, but it's very interesting as a way of seeing the things we need to be experimenting with, the things we need to be imagining to respond to the changes that are under it. It's a laboratory, if you like. It's becoming an interesting laboratory that can contribute to general thinking about what we want in the EU for culture, and also what we are doing on a day-to-day basis in our cultural activities. So we have a struggle here between different narratives, different ways of seeing things. There is the Anglo-Saxon free market model you talked about, and when we look at how the cultural economy works in the English-speaking countries, and we see the solidarity activities as well in that cultural sector, in those countries, is perhaps much more complex than we often imagine. So there is a construction process which is underway in Creative Europe, is the heir to a certain number of experiments which have been conducted. So roughly speaking, we have a program which over the years has picked up and merged a number of different initiatives with different approaches. There's a first package which is called Culture, but which isn't exactly culture, which is to encourage cooperation between cultural actors of all kinds to try to address this transformation. So to do this sometimes in an experimental way, sometimes in a structural way. There can be different ways, different subsidies for small projects or for medium-sized projects or for larger projects, more structural or more experimental, and always mixing different countries. The European logic is that it should be multilateral. So one of the things that is interesting here is we can't construct Europe on our own. It does need to be multilateral. We have to do things with other people. It might not be easy. We have to learn along the way, but that's the whole interest of experimenting together.
And then there's another packet that's a bit older. We're talking about 30 years. You know, you've got the culture section, the media question. This became structured over time based on an industrial kind of approach. So a reading of the needs of industry, therefore, the needs to change the type of sports being used. So a first part, so let's clarify things. Let's talk about the organization of lots of different calls. Some support questions of creation, some questions of broadcasting, the changes to policies. Well, series of calls that are part of the value stream, you know, how things are built, you know, from the time when you start to have an idea and the time you bring it to fruition with all of the different educational systems, etc. So it's a long cycle economy, yes, a very long cycle, but it's an industry that is senior with respect to the audiovisual sector. We don't have that for music, for example. We're not talking about the same thing. But what are we seeing? We're seeing that this media part, it's mainly audiovisual, and the borders are becoming more porous between what is specific to audiovisual aspects of cinema and, different platforms that we're seeing as well, that are multimedia platforms. And I'm not even talking about platforms where you buy books and shoes and what have you. And then there's a third part that we need to talk about with hybrid practices. Lots of cultural objects, lots of cultural practices are being invented, are mutating, changing. And we're not abandoning old forms. There will always be books made of paper, but there are other things alongside books made of paper. So it's difficult now to distinguish between an object, a game, and what is digital. Now, all of this is happening when we talk about culture. I said it was a small subject, but, do we want a European culture policy that's like the French culture policy? Well, this is what I think French stakeholders would like. Perhaps what we've invented is something that is very different, that respects the individuality of each, national specifics, and that's maybe what we need to imagine. We want to accompany the changes to the way we live. When we talk about the importance of in the program, it's the change of our relationship to living beings, without talking about what's made of carbon, what's not. That change, that mutation, is a cultural mutation that is happening in the sector itself. It's thinking about its practices. Perhaps our practices can be different in the future. But what is our role as a cultural actor, as an artist, given all of these different changes? But we could talk about other kinds of mutations as well. Our colleague in Brussels was talking about gender policies, or sexual minority policy, or sexual policies. We're seeing the same mutations, and that's quite difficult. No, it's not easy, not very easy in Poland at the moment, or in Hungary. We need to know what we want. And something else that's not easy here is to think about things in relation to the past with cultural minorities, etc. These mutations are difficult because of this, and Europe Creative is a real laboratory for all of this. And the whole thing is happening when we've got a relationship to information, knowledge, and making of knowledge, and the information about the world. This trans-sector aspect is very interesting because it's all about, seizing and seizing what we have. It's you've got to implement policies when you've got to seize this central object, which is our relationship to the reality of today, to information today. With all of the things that are being overturned, with the alternatives being offered, and financial instruments as well that support. Yes, that's the decor. And then you have interpretation readings. A financial instrument, what is it? Well, it is, okay, this sector has some specific aspects. So in terms of capitalization, it's a sector where there are many, many companies. Often, we look at that as, it's a public economy, it's all association-based, etc. But, it's a sector that has the same kind of problems. There was a financial instrument in the previous program. It's been taken out of that program. When we say increase, well, there are bits that have been taken out. It's a substantial increase. So more invested elsewhere, therefore. So this relationship with the financial structuring of the sector is enshrined in another tool that's going to manage all of these supports, all of the financial aid to companies and stakeholders. So we need to look at these questions: anthropological, artistic, aesthetic, cultural, and we've got to look at these economic questions: the flows, the world flows, changes in flows, changes in traffic, and the microeconomy of cultural companies. Because what's really going to hit hard is, well, this fact that we have this very fragile microeconomy. It's highly dependent. It's also very responsive. Perhaps we can act quite quickly, but at the same time, there are many questions about that. So, we need to support this microeconomy. So, we've got the program. We've got these three parts. and supporting an industry, well, it means having means. 60% of the program is about that. Yes, so the media sector, the audiovisual sector, 805 million. Now, in the European Parliament's letter, it says that Europe Creative must help music. Music comes out of that letter. So this is a declaration, and when we look at the figures, you can see there's a big gap between audiovisual and culture, which is rather paradoxical because the audiovisual world suffered less from the health crisis than live shows. How do you see things? Is there, are we behind in terms of live shows with respect to media and audiovisual aspects? Yes, it's 33% for the culture envelope, so that's for all sectors. And today, music has suffered a lot from the crisis, as we've said, but it's also a sector that's very important from an economic point of view. It's got even more employees than the audiovisual sector, so there really is a gap. How do you explain that gap? Well, one of the reasons is that the audiovisual sector has been able to lobby Brussels more and faster. It's taken its collective voice to Brussels sooner, saying that we need financing, whereas the music sector is different. It's a sector with lots of with many self-made women. So everybody was in their corridor in Europe. Nobody talked to each other. And it was in 2015 with the Labi Music Working Group, that was the first dialogue between the sector and the European Commission. It was the first time, in fact, that we had representatives from all the music sector together in the same room to really talk about what was needed in the music sector and how these needs could be dealt with. And then there was a preparation action. We tested out what the financing possibilities were for music. We looked at the tools that might support this and how to have a focus in the next program. So there's Creative Europe with the legal text for the next 7 years, and it says black on white that there will be actions for certain sectors and that notably the music sector will be one of the sectors to be supported. So as a priority, therefore. But so what you're saying is interesting because we see the same in France, for example. The CNC for cinema is a big authority, the CNM, the National Music Center as well. Yes, that's right. It took a long time to get the CNM up and going. I think, we were behind, as Pascal was saying. There was a question of professionalizing the sector, structuring the sector, but the music sector now has the wind in its sails. It really has an awful lot of development potential, and a lot of national and European support would really boost this sector, not just at European level, but also in terms of its international notoriety. So the program that I coordinate, that's what it's all about. We're trying to make sure that young European artists find it easier to go around Europe and to export. This is important for the music sector. How do you develop? How do you export? How do you benefit from something that's more international? Yes, how do you accentuate your mobility? Gabriele in Brussels, what do you think about the distribution of the budget for Europe Creative? Do you find it's rather unequal depending on the arts? Or are you very happy that the audiovisual program has its 1.4 billion? Gabriele. Thank you, Antoine, for the question.
Let's say that, it's pretty much the same as we knew from the previous the previous period. So actually culture went from 31 to 33, and then the rest for the audiovisual, and the cross-sectorial strand, so the third strand of Creative Europe, where actually the news media are, for example, financed, that in comparison, a bit of sort of grew, because I mean, before, in the previous 7 years, this is gonna become a bit more arid and technical, but in the previous year, there was also the guarantee facility scheme in the cross-sectorial strand, whereas now it is outside of Creative Europe, so the cross-sectorial strand can indeed finance cross-sectorial projects, or the Creative Europe desks, more rather than just the guarantee scheme per se. So I mean, the percentages, the ratio is pretty much as we knew it from before. I must say that Culture Action Europe, being a cross-sectorial, the only major cross-sectorial network, does not represent one specific subsector in culture, but actually is very keen on also contaminating subsectors, but also with other sectors. So bridging towards other sectors of our societies, I mean, from environment to rights and values. So I don't see it as a detrimental thing, how it is broken down specifically, the program. What I'm more interested maybe in terms of key figures of the program is the fact that the budget that you rightly said before, it's more than 50% more. And if I can open a parenthesis on that, just a quick thing, the cultural and creative sectors in Europe have been campaigning for years, asking for doubling Creative Europe. From 1.4 billion to now it's almost 2.5. I mean, we do not always celebrate success because, of course, we need to police and to monitor what happens. But that was also due to the crisis, but it was also a success of a campaign of doubling for culture, doubling Creative Europe that has been led by the sectors. Now, one last thing that I wanted to say, it is more on the budget of Creative Europe. We were speaking of the recovery plan at the beginning, and the fact that, of course, the recovery plan is front-loading money in the first years when we need an immediate recovery in the 1-2 years to come. We see that somehow this model has been replicated in Creative Europe, because we see that then most of the money, majority, is front-loaded in the first 2 years of the program, so 2021 and 2022. That, from a political perspective, the reasoning is, rather simple. The political message was giving immediate relief to the culture and creative sectors. We just need not to, to continue this work and make sure that also in the last years of the programs, the budget is actually distributed in a way that, there are more opportunities and not less. But the key structure in these 2 years is indeed that of giving immediate relief. Another way of giving immediate relief is, of course, also, we will know that in a few weeks, but also leaving the call as open as much open as possible, because that way, also small organizations can get in the way, can fill in their application and can participate. But at the end of the day, one last remark, if I may say so, Pascal Brunet was very much speaking of the policy priorities of the Green Deal. Those are all priorities that need culture to be, to be mainstreamed also in the European discourse, also in the European life. One key thing then is, of course, that we see that the projects of Creative Europe will be closely linked to the policy priorities for the years to come. The Green Deal, the digital transition, gender equality, upholding rights, and so on and so forth. That is key because, we understand that only through culture we can advance those priorities on the one hand, and on the other hand, projects are not just self-standing. Projects also in the cultural field, Creative Europe projects are there because they are also connected to overarching priorities of the EU.
Alors peut-être justement, j'ai envie de faire la transition avec vous, Pascal, par rapport, on a parlé de cette répartition du budget, mais aussi un petit peu de ces nouveaux...
So we've talked about that budget, we've talked about these new things, there's going to be a unique action, there's going to be co-financing rates. What's going to change concretely for cultural project leaders? Elise said it's a bit simpler to fill in European requests, applications. Are we going towards more flexibility? How do you see that with the one-stop shop appearance? Well, I think what Elise and Gabriele were saying is right. You know, we're in front of a transformation that, you know, that we're really being listened to. The machine is being simplified, okay, but it's not going to be that easy. There's a real determination to do it. The authorities want to simplify things. So we've got this impression of a bureaucratic machine that doesn't listen, but it's not exactly true. There are rules, community rules, that we find in all authorities. You know, if you want to apply for something to the region, it's a little bit like applying for something at a larger level. You know, you have audits, there are questions that you find at community level as well. So the problem is the time between this promise to simplify things and when it actually happens. September, it's quite quick. Yes, will we all be happy in September? Will we all be listened to 100% in September? I don't think things will happen like that. You know, okay, there's the idea of the online tool, a digital platform. It's not going to be that easy to begin with. But I think there is a real wish to monitor projects better. When you've got a European contract, for example, you have to follow that contract. And if you change partners or change shares, or you have to negotiate, set up an addendum, and change the program, ask that whether people agree to change the program in a sector that is undergoing a crisis, that is undergoing transformation. It's very important to be very close to that kind of thing. Everything that is done with that in mind. Now, things are hard now, but hard because things need to become simpler. So Bulgaria, this is what we're seeing. You know, there are cases of corruption with funds from Creative Europe. But, you know, there have to be protections as well. Yes. Yes, there have been affairs of corruption, and Europe is based on integrity. It's the European authority is based on integrity. No, it's not all about helping people to be corrupt, of course. The most complicated thing is the positioning of what we're going to do and why we're applying for a European project. You don't do this just to continue or just to find some kind of palliative, some kind of sponsorship. Yes. So we go to Europe to ask as Europeans, to ask questions as Europeans. So this is what's happening in detail. No, this is what's happening in the sector, in a room, you know, right at the, you know, what's happening on a TV, in a TV studio. And then it's what's happening at a higher level. And that's where Europe is complicated. You know, you've got to imagine yourself as a European stakeholder, not as something else. You know, that's the positioning problem. So, Elise, I'd like to have your idea with respect to this, your point of view. You know, we've got this new program for Creative Europe, this increase in co-financing. Are these things that will impact the music sector? How do you see these things? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very positive. You know, it's all about battles that the culture sector has been involved in, you know, making access more, making things more accessible to small and medium-sized companies. You know, there's going to be a dedicated cause. So we're still waiting for more information about that. But for the future as well, for the future years, it's important to see how this music sector action will be developed. I was saying at the start that there are many ideas that have been really highlighted through studies, notably the studies that I invite you to look at, Music Measure Europe, where they talk about the need for financing in the music sector, but also feasibility studies. How do you set up a European Music Observatory? That's one thing that's been studied. And these are things that I would like to see come to see the light of day in the future. And what about so I'm talking. This includes, of course, Great Britain. Music. So that yes, I'm referring to another study that's also very important that includes Great Britain. Now, Gabriele, are you still with us? Yes. So our Brussels correspondent, Gabriele. Gabriele, we're seeing all of these changes. And this question of meaning that Pascal was talking about, so beyond technocratic questions, I'd like to come back to you now before we finish this debate and before the questions that we might be receiving in a few moments. I'd like to come back to the idea of developing the European cultural policy and looking at its obstacles. We've talked about Brexit, of course. And that's an important question. But can you see a possibility of harmonizing European cultural policies? And what about with countries that are in the east of Europe that often use culture as a tool for propaganda? These are countries that devote the highest share of their budget to culture. For Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban's Hungary has a very high budget for culture. Now, of course, there's a nationalist message there, but how can you see this? How do you see this question of harmonization? Will it be possible? What about copyright as well? Copyright. The question of copyright went forward to Parliament. Should Europe speak with one voice when it comes to culture? Thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. The example of Hungary is a very relevant example indeed.
I think that we saw that happening, especially when brainstorming about the national plans. The national plans, the recovery plans are unfolding at national level. And so you had these two contrasting forces. On the one hand, you wanted to include culture in those plans, but at the end of the day, you know that those are national plans and those are going to be channeled to national culture, to the identitarian narrative, as you very rightly mentioned in a specific country that is Hungary. What we need to uphold there is indeed then the key topic of cultural cooperation, of cross-border cultural cooperation, instead of that paradigm of a nationalistic or even localistic culture. The equilibrium is very difficult to find there, but I think that building together a set of European cultures, let's use the plural and not be scared about using the plural, about speaking of cultures. But the idea is really to empower cultural cooperation so that a European culture happens. So that can happen through subsidies, like Creative Europe is, but also through shifting the regulatory approach. You mentioned the copyright directive, which is probably one of the biggest battles fought in the past legislative term, past commission. It was another era, another geological era maybe for European politics, whereas now we know that the transposition date for the copyright directive has just passed. Not all member states have included that, transposed that in their national legislation. What we see now is another interesting battle that is just about to start. It has been triggered by the pandemic, and it is the one about the working conditions of artists and cultural workers. All those who are employed in a sector that then was the most hit sector by the crisis, or the second most hit sector by the crisis. The European institutions have started speaking of this topic. The European Parliament has passed a resolution, will vote another one in the weeks to come. There is some willingness of doing something, but that, of course, is contrasted by the fact that very little can be done in terms of, or nothing can be done in terms of hard law. You can adopt resolutions, you can have wishful thinking, but nothing can really happen. So I think that the most positive thing that now can happen is having this very clear in the debate. And what must be clear also in the debate is that, debate a European debate. So let's nurture a European debate, like the Sfera project that you are also presenting these days wants to do. I mean, really nurturing a European public opinion. So that's one way to go. And the other way to go is, of course, making sure that all this money that will be channeled in the years to come to the capitals is spent in a European way, in a European fashions, and not to build walls or to separate our societies, but indeed actually to make them closer to each other. One last remark, also the need to have an equal, let's say 2% in each member states for culture is not just because we need it because not to leave anyone behind. There are member states that have been spending for culture more than others, but then no one wants a Europe that leaves others behind. And then we see, for example, smaller member states that are then moving at a slower pace than others, also in the recovery of their cultural and creative sectors. But it was a very complex question, so sorry for the...
Non, c'est très important. Une dernière question très courte avant les questions.
And one last very quick question. We talked about the new things that would be implemented, but even before Creative Europe and before culture was introduced as a European power, there was a system, European cultural capitals. There were some successful cases, Lille, notably in France, and some others. Many others which were more debatable or failed, perhaps, leading to gentrification of some districts or debt in some cities. Does that system not have to be rethought at this time when we're seeing a shift in paradigm in culture at European level, when we're talking about digital development, ecological transition? Can these dinosaurs, like the European capitals of culture, continue? It might be a dinosaur, but it can be something that's very important for the European symbolism of culture. So perhaps it needs rethinking in light of the digital or ecological transition with, for example, networks between countries. We learned a few months ago, for example, that there is a city in Slovenia which has presented a project with a city in Italy, Nova Gorica and Gorizia, which are going to be European culture, capital of culture together, as they are, it's symbolic, as they are on the border between these two countries at the heart of Europe. So perhaps it needs rethinking, but I think that as a European symbol, this is a project that does need to be kept as being central to European cultural policies. And there have been French capitals of culture as well. So we even apply that at national level. And also Italy has a committee based on the European example. So as an Italian capital of culture each year, so there can be some things that other countries might perhaps do. So Italy and France do a lot of similar things in culture, perhaps not always for the best reason, but now we move on to the questions. Open up to the floor. So if you have any questions, you're free to ask any questions. We're not in Pyongyang in North Korea. Feel free to ask any questions you might have about European cultural policy. You have the best experts here to answer you, or some of the best at the very least. So it's open to you for your questions.
On va vous passer un micro.
We're going to hand you a microphone. and it's even been wiped and disinfected to comply with the health guidelines. I have a question about the Creative Europe programme as it's been announced. A number of changes have been announced, but you didn't go into too much detail about that. Regarding the question of the Green Deal, the question of inclusion and the digital era, could we go into a bit more detail about what all this implies? Pascal, perhaps? It's the integration of the political priorities into the system, also changes in the architecture of the program. For example, the new thing in the cultural side is between small cooperation, medium-sized cooperation and large cooperation, so taking account of the fact that the networking powers of cultural players are not all the same. Perhaps we should have the possibility to start with 2 or 3 players, then scale up to larger things. So there's a change in the architecture of the system and in the management procedures. Regarding the political priorities and their inclusion in this, we have the announcement so far, which are becoming more clear, and are being translated into the different policies, but I think there's still a lot to be done here. So I think you really need to look at the culture part of Creative Europe as a place for experimentation. So what is the contribution of our sector to these major transformations underway in society, and this is the way the project needs to be looked at, I think. Obviously, trying to see what our problems are in the sector specifically. We need to reorganize cooperation and the ways of management in our sector, but we have to look at how we can contribute in that respect. So this is a translation of the political priorities. So at the beginning we said they're going to be talking about decarbonizing activities for the Green Deal and being less carbon intensive. But in fact, I see that a lot of the thinking that's going on with new there are new systems, but they are thinking we can see globally about the living world. So it might open up doors towards sectors like housing, diet, mobility. So we need to open up all those different scopes, and what is needed is to have a balance between the environmental pillar, the societal pillar on questions of equity, and the digital pillar, which was very clearly presented by President van der Leyen, saying that democracy is not doing so well in Europe, and the challenge of all our policies has to be to address this question of democracy and its weaknesses, and this is central, whether it's in terms of identity.
Voilà, excusez-moi. Non, parce que
Sorry, I'm mixing everything up. So we really need to address all these questions and to fit them all together. So a lot of imagination is needed. I think it's interesting because this is one of the few areas where we can rethink things. If we look at national policies today, it's very restrictive, lots of silos, very organized. Here we have perhaps some new possibilities that are opening up, and regarding also these questions of perhaps in France we see this as authority that is central, whereas it's seen as being more decentralized in Germany. And I think in France we have to develop a new relationship with this reality, which is that there is something which is being constructed. Politics and policy are being reinvented. So let's stop looking at the central level as being the center of a top-down system and think there's something which is being reinvented here, which means that we have to take things up ourselves if we have things to do, things to say. And here at European Lab, we have things to say for Europe, and we can get organized in that respect. And I think that is the future for Creative Europe. I'm sorry, the microphone isn't working.
Merci. Du coup, vous avez dit que
so you said that this is an opportunity to come up with a response, taking account of other things than merely culture. But my question is, therefore, will the Creative Europe program be open to other people than actors in the cultural and creative sector? Because until now it was dedicated to them. It was difficult to open up to people from other areas. Does this mean that now we will be able to work with people from alternative other sectors? Yes. And it's always this question of balance. In fact, if we open up too much, we lose the specific cultural element, and if we cut ourselves off, we just remain among ourselves. And we need to work with engineers and with specialists in all sorts of different areas. And most important, to be capable of working with civil society, which is always a bit complicated, this question of civil society, but we're seeing everywhere groups organizing themselves to work on issues, on environmental issues, on the use of digital technologies, on forms of participation or alternative forms of decision-making, or also a lot of grassroots metrology emerging, which do create this need to bring in groups who should not be seen as mere amateurs, but who are citizens, which are addressing questions of culture. So we have to take account of this change, and we have to see how far we can go with this in Creative Europe. And then there is also blending, I think, which is going to emerge, like with a blended Scotch whisky, to really make use of all the different European systems with Creative Europe, with perhaps the research program, education programs, Erasmus. So perhaps make a cocktail to mix together, to really mix together the different European systems, identifying and conceptualizing the issues, and then having a very practical, hands-on approach to address these different issues, and coming up with practical responses. Perhaps before the next question with you, Elise, regarding these imperatives, and at the moment we're talking about the announcements, it is taking shape, but what do you think about these ecological and digital priorities for music? Obviously, I haven't had the chance to read through the things yet, but looking at the work programs and the priorities, I think that what does seem to be the big change in paradigm with these three priorities, which are going to be important, are inclusion, gender equity, and environment. I think those really are the three focuses which are going to be of key importance, and that is also a shift in paradigm from the previous program. Before, you were talking a lot about changes of business model and a much more economic approach, which is still there. The two focuses are promoting diversity and competitiveness, so the economic side is still there, but there is also this idea of including the challenges, the even more important and urgent challenges today, and I think this will also continue to be done, and I think this is specific to European processes, with via incentives rather than through binding rules. We're going to encourage projects to think about these questions, to come up with their own ways of working, their own mechanisms, and once again, if I compare this with Live Europe, we have always had an incentive approach to things. We're not going to force our concert venues to have a quota of emerging European artists. We're going to try to use the carrot rather than the stick, try to encourage and provide incentives to do more European, but also through the funding perhaps to have a safety net there to encourage people to take risks a bit more, because that is also what we need to do. The idea is to take risks where there are sometimes considerable financial costs. And another question?
Oui, c'est bon. Non, ma question, c'est plus...
My question is more, after reading for the support, they explain to project leaders that digital transition doesn't necessarily fit in with ecology, because there are things which are associated in the development focuses of the different programs. Before, there was a lot of focus on mobility, and today the question of mobility of audiences on the European continent is being challenged. So today, when we're combining digital transition and a Green Deal, how can we take account of this? Because the digital transition isn't necessarily ecological. For Gabriele, perhaps could explain how we can do things locally and ecology when we have mobility of artists, and we know there is, and the environmental impact of the digital technologies. Is this not all a bit paradoxical, Gabriele?
C'est un truc dont on parle, c'est vrai aussi.
This is something that we talk with political decision makers in Europe when we talk about the impact of digital technologies on the environment. And I've just learned that there will also be a debate in the National Assembly, because that is a good thing, because if we're talking about twin transitions, we also need to think about the effect, the fact that the digital transition is not without its costs for the environment.
That is indeed the new European Bauhaus project that Pascal Brunet was mentioning before. I mean, among the various other things other than Creative Europe that are interesting for the cultural players, because that's precisely look at the way, I mean, according to the slogans, because that's what we have for now, but let's hope that the slogans will be converted in something more concrete. The way we live together, that's also about the way we will live together in, I mean, not just the places where we, the houses of the future, but also the public spaces of the future, but also the way we commute in the future. And mobility is key. It was mentioned in the question also for the cultural players. Mobility is key, and Creative Europe also integrates. It integrates Moves Europe, as it was mentioned by Elise before. It integrates also Iportunus, which some of you will remember was a pilot project on individual mobility of artists in Europe that will now be reintegrated in Creative Europe. It's going to be interesting to see indeed how upholding a necessary physical mobility of artists in Europe will be complemented with the climate goal and the fact that we want to also empower the digital transition. That's to say that I don't have an answer as of the moment, but as it was said before, it is interesting to use also, I mean, to make use of these projects. There is one, for example, ongoing at the moment. It's a Creative Europe project. It's called Perform Europe, which is indeed studying and assessing the way that performing arts can translate in the new world and in a mix, in a blended world of physical and digital, of physical mobility and digital content. The study, the assessment of what is out there is key and is crucial, and I think we all should make use indeed of the opportunity of the new programs to trigger that.
Merci. C'était pas une réponse, mais quand même un peu. Merci, Gabriele. Une autre question?
Merci, oui, bonjour.
Hello. So coming back to what you said earlier about the cross-cutting opportunities, the transversal opportunities for financing culture and artistic projects in Europe through the different systems and tools that exist, I wanted to know in very practical terms, is the European Union perhaps trying to find a more effective and harmonized way to enable people and project leaders to adopt a more transversal cross-cutting approach? Because if we look at the expenses reporting tools and the results indicators, they are different between Horizon Europe, Creative Europe, and the different programs, which requires a lot of work, a lot of effort by cultural players to implement all these measures, to be able to handle all these different indicators and reporting systems.
Oui, je pense que
I think there's a lot of things which still need to be invented. We could talk about democracy and digital. There is a huge progress for democracy through digital technologies, which also represent a risk. So we have to find solutions, because nobody has an answer on how we can find the right balance. And in management, it's exactly the same thing. There isn't a Creative Europe program where they say that you must fill out your evaluation criteria in a given way. They ask you what are the evaluation criteria that you want to see selected for your project. And I think that's the opportunity we need to grasp, the way we are evaluated, rather than seeing how they want to evaluate us from the top down. I think we're using public money. We therefore are accountable on what we do. If we're taking public money, we have to report back, but we have to perhaps see how we want to report back, what indicators we might want on gender equality, on transformation. And in Creative Europe, this can be relatively interesting. It's different from all the financial reporting issues, which we hope are going to be simplified. I've said we're hoping in theory they should be simplified. I'm still being cautious for the moment, but we're headed towards a more simple system. But evaluation, that is something we really need to take up as responsible public players. What do we want to be evaluated on? It can't be on vague notions that we have an impact on economic development, which we see often in applications. Okay, but what, how, could you be more precise? Whereas often where we don't provide real indicators about what a public stakeholder in culture is and what we should be evaluated on. So in Creative Europe, that's relatively open, and we need to seize that opportunity. Well, it's interesting to ask all these questions with this new European budget, Creative Europe. I'm sure there are other questions, but we've already gone slightly over time. Many thanks to all of you for being with us here today. So to you also, Gabriele, Rosana, for being with us, and Pascal and Elise, coordinator of Live Europe. Thank you also to all of you for following us. So, what New Deal for Europe with Creative Europe? We haven't perhaps found an answer, but there are lots of questions there that we can try to answer in the future. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you to all of you. A quick word just to indicate that we'll be continuing the discussions here in our television studio, discussing self-employed, freelance, independent cultural actors who have issued a call recently, looking at how they've come through the crisis, what sort of proposals they have for the future, and the discussion about the new Creative Europe program will be continuing on in our radio studio with a focus on the media, news media, which for the first time it would appear are taken into account in the new program, which opens up some opportunities for emerging media And as we've seen with Sphera, our partners organising this debate. Thank you very much.